Welcome everybody to this webinar on the EU-UK agreement. I just ask you to be patient for a few minutes since we're still seeing people joining us, but we will start very, very soon once we've got a few more of the participants on board. So you're in the right channel and we're looking forward to giving you, I hope, what will be an entertaining and informative webinar. If you just leave us to wait for a few more people, we can start in, let us say, 2 to 3 minutes. Thank you very much. And don't go away. Okay, people are still joining us, but I think rather than wait too long, I'd like to start. And first of all, to say to everybody who's tuned in, welcome to this webinar organized by Wood Peterson here in Brussels. We are really interested to also hear your questions. And if you look in the chat, there is a function to put questions to the panel. What we'll be planning to do as sort of running order is to ask each of the 4 panel members to make some introductory remarks about various aspects of the EU-UK agreement, and then give them a few minutes to disagree with each other in the panel, and then open then the floor to your questions. I'd like to introduce everybody on the panel. I'm going to try and keep as quiet as possible since I can usually shoot my mouth off on anything, but I will act as the moderator today. My name is Neil McMillan. I am a senior advisor here at Wood Peterson. I spent 30 years of my life working in the UK public service, and also have done various jobs since then in public affairs consultancy and also trade associations across Brussels. Let me introduce the speakers also in the order that they will be speaking. So my first colleague to introduce is Dan Dalton, who's also a special advisor here in Wood Peterson. Dan is a former MEP and was coordinator for the ECR in the Internal Market Committee of Parliament, and is somebody we always turn to when we need to know about what's happening in the European Parliament and the dynamics within the EU politically more generally. And he will be talking to us about the agreement and then also some of the political dynamics, both in the EU and in the UK. He'll be followed by Katrina Williams, who's also a special advisor here at Ruud Peterson. She was former ambassador and deputy permanent representative to the EU when in the UK we were still a member of the EU, but also worked in the Prime Minister's EU and Global Affairs Secretariat in the Cabinet Office in London, and also had a long background in agriculture policy in the UK and in the EU. Matt Hind, who is an ex-colleague of mine from the UK as well, is head of international and policy engagement in the National Grid, which is the UK electricity transmission and infrastructure organisation. He's also on the board of the British Chamber of Commerce here in Brussels. And he'll be talking about something which I wish to pay tribute to him as a major force in actually getting us to where we are, the energy elements of the EU-UK agreement. And then finally, but certainly not last but least, is Mark Verheugen, who's also my colleague here at Ruud Peterson. He was formerly a number of very senior jobs in the Commission, but one of those obviously was former EU ambassador to the WTO in Geneva, and also a number of senior posts dealing with climate change, with sustainability, and many other things. So that is your panel. And as I say, at the end, we'll open up the floor for your questions. So please think about things that you want to put to the panel. And let us perhaps start with Dan, if you are ready to talk, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. I think I'm just going to give a little overview, first of all, of what's in the agreement. I mean, first of all, there's general principles in the agreement, but a lot of the details, in fact, most of the details have not been agreed yet. You can't hear me?
We can.
Can you hear me? Yeah, Neil, you can't, maybe.
I can
Can
hear
I just
you,
check?
Dan.
Do other members of the panel hear him?
Yep.
We do.
Yep, okay. It's just my problem in that case.
Okay, well, maybe I'm talking to no one, but either way, yeah. So, I mean, in the first case, these are agreements on principles on the whole. Like the details have not yet been agreed or negotiated. So there's still quite a long way to go in a lot of these. But broadly, the agreement bases on, so the main bit of it really is an agreement on what they call SPS standards, so sanitary and phytosanitary standards, which are agri-food standards, where the UK will agree to align with EU standards, not just today, but also in the future. And in return for that, the UK will get agri-food access back into the European market. In addition to that, there's a youth mobility scheme that's been agreed in principle, which will allow people between 18 and either 30 or 35 years of age to be able to spend a limited amount of time working in the other side of the channel, if you like, between the UK and the EU. Which was an ask mainly from the EU, but that still to be negotiated, but still looks fairly positive from an agreement point of view. The UK also agrees to rejoin the Erasmus scheme, and the two sides have agreed to do some further work to get an agreement on touring artist visas. So these are top groups that are going across the channel. The electricity market, there's an agreement to try and align them much more closely together. Also, the UK and the EU will align their ETS schemes, which from the UK perspective would probably mean the UK would be spared some of the carbon border adjustment mechanism charges that are likely to come in the future. In the only real pure old-fashioned trade element of this, I think, is that the EU has agreed to give the UK their steel tariff-free quota back. There'll be cooperation on migration. The UK will get access to some of the EU criminal record databases. There's also a broad agreement in principle that the UK will get access to the safe defence procurement scheme that's just being set up for defence. There's an agreement on fishing rights as well, in that the existing agreement that was due to run out next year would be extended by 12 years to 2038. And in addition to that, future work on the mutual recognition of qualifications. And a final one, the UK nationals will be able to use e-gates when they're traveling into the EU. So, I mean, that's, I think, most of the main elements of the agreement. Most of these need further work, of course, and the devil is always in the detail. The response to this, I think, in the UK, it's fair to say the response has been somewhat mixed. Certainly from the media, many of the sort of right-leaning newspapers have come out very strongly against this. The other political parties in the UK are also mixed. So the Liberal Democrats, who are quite supportive of this. The reaction from the SNP, who are the Scottish Nationalist Party, has been mixed. They have some concerns about the fishing element of this. But beyond that, they're obviously quite pleased to get closer alignment in other areas. But I think the real question here is of the sort of Reform Party, which is Nigel Farage's party, and the Conservatives. So Reform predictably are 100% against all elements of the deal. Interestingly, though, between that, Nigel Farage himself has not said very much. He hasn't specifically come out and spoken a lot about the deal. And I think that's quite interesting, because the rest of the party predictably is 100% against it, but he is... he's not really been seen on it over the last week or so. The Conservative Party, on the other hand, have come out fully to say they'll reverse all of this if they get into power. And that's probably predictable political position to take now, but there would be a question of what would happen in 3 or 4 years' time when some of these elements are bedded in, and whether that politically is feasible in 3 or 4 years' time, particularly on the youth mobility and the SPS agreement, for example, because that would again mean a big shake-up to what would then be the status quo. But at the moment, that's the position. I mean, there's not really any there's no danger of the government not getting this through if any of it needs to go to a vote. They have a very big majority, and they have the support more or less of the Lib Dems. So from the UK side, I don't think there's any, going to be any repeat of the drama that we saw over previous negotiations in Parliament. From the EU side, I mean, from what I've seen, there hasn't been a huge reaction either way. There is an existing agreement going on, or discussions going on, between the UK and the EU and Gibraltar on some elements to do with Gibraltar's status. Now, that is causing some problem in the Parliament across a number of fields, and I expect there's likely to be an agreement on Gibraltar in the near future as well, which would free up any potential opposition there might be in Brussels from particularly Spanish politicians. I would say generally, both sides seem to have moved quite a long way on this. The UK, clearly has moved quite substantially on the dynamic alignment of SPS, because that means giving up sovereignty in that area to make their own regulations, and also on the youth mobility, which is a challenge given the political debate on immigration in the UK. But from the EU side as well, I mean, they've moved quite substantially from their previous positions in these negotiations, because it was always there could be no cherry picking of the single market, but in this case, it does appear to be on the SPS, but also to a certain extent on some of the energy stuff, that the single market does seem to be the UK does seem to be able to cherry pick access in some areas, but not in other areas. Whether that develops in Brussels remains to be seen. I don't think it will. I think more or less on both sides there's broad acknowledgement that this deal will go through. But as I said at the start, the details have still got to be negotiated on many of these things. And as we always know in Brussels, the devil is in the detail.
Thanks very, very much indeed, Dan. Somebody said life is not a bowl of cherries, but let us hope that we get there somehow, and not too late, because I think it's a really important deal, or at least an agreement about agreeing a deal anyway. Can I pass the floor now to Katrina?
Great, thanks, Neil, and good morning, everybody. And Dan said the devil is in the detail. Well, I am the devil who's going to talk to you about some of the detail on sanitary and phytosanitary and on fish. I'm also primed to talk about youth mobility and e-gates if anybody wants to please say so in the chat, but I'm going to assume you're mostly interested in the sanitary and phytosanitary elements and on fish. And I think the first thing to say on the sanitary and phytosanitary chapter is there is a lot of work still to do. Nothing will change imminently, but the most important thing is that positive tone. There is a sense of mutual goodwill which comes from the agreement. And as Dan indicated, I think actually both sides have moved very, very substantially, which should make an interesting and positive negotiation possible. So, for example, on the EU side, the acknowledgement that maybe you have bespoke arrangements for the UK, which take you away from Michel Barnier's famous staircase of agreements and look at something that is more bespoke, is a really significant move. And as Dan indicated, the move by the UK to contemplate dynamic alignment and the role for the ECJ is really, really significant. So the main elements, that commitment to a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, which would allow the vast majority of animal and plant products to move between the UK and the EU without certificates or controls. There's a helpful attempt to define the scope. So it's sanitary, phytosanitary, food safety, consumer protection rules, and organic standards. I think that is helpful because it avoids this deal becoming something large and unwieldy. So that should be potentially useful. There's the commitment to dynamic alignment, as part of which the UK would be consulted early on new measures, but would not have the right to participate in EU meetings. But early consultation would be a part of that. As all member states do, the UK retains the right to act in relation to biosecurity and health if necessary in an emergency to protect its people and its market. And a dispute resolution provision, independent arbitration, but with recognition that the ECJ would be the ultimate authority, and the UK making a financial contribution to support the costs of all of the measures. So far so good. That's a really good structure, I think, for reaching an agreement. But it won't be the work of a moment. And the text significantly gives no timetable for any of this work. I actually think that's a good thing. I think nobody wants to be subjected to the infamous ticking clock ever again when it comes to agreeing things as important as this. But I think, there will be a lot of detail to be worked through. So, for example, I think people will have to work quite hard to keep that scope narrow. I can see debates erupting about whether the UK's due diligence legislation on third country imports, for example, needs to align with the EU legislation for the sake of consumer protection. In the past, there have been big debates about whether to protect the competitive position of the EU food industry, you need to look at social legislation. So I hope that the negotiators will be able to keep that scope really narrow, because I think that's key to success. There'll need to be lots of conversations about where the UK has diverged. First of all, to determine where the UK has diverged from EU legislation. There's provision for that in the agreement, and there are some obvious instances, for example, on gene editing, where the UK has moved ahead of the EU. But I think it will take some time both to work through where the divergence is and what guarantees you then need to put in place to protect the EU market from the consequences of that divergence. I can see there being a vigorous debate about money. And if my former colleagues in Her Majesty's Treasury are anything to go by, I think those might get quite heated about how much of the cost of the EU systems the UK should incur. But actually, the access to the early warning systems that would flow as a consequence will have immense value to the UK economy in terms of protecting markets and producers and consumers from disease incursions. And then there is the sheer implementation of this. I've heard an estimate that to implement an SPS deal, the UK government would need to table 200 statutory instruments in its parliament. That takes up an awful lot of parliamentary time, and given that they would likely be controversial, quite a lot of emotional and political effort. And this all comes at a time when UK departments, for fiscal reasons, are facing potential reductions of between 25% and 40% in their headcount. So my guess, not only on SPS, but on the agreement more generally, is that some of it will be staged. And I think there is an issue for those of you who have business interests listening on the call about which elements you want the parties to prioritise as they go through this. So a good basis, but a lot of work to do. Importantly, I think it needs to be a basis to build back trust. And that means that both sides need only to agree to things that they can implement, and they then need to get on and implement them. One of the difficulties with the exit arrangements and the TCA was that some elements of it weren't actually capable of being implemented perfectly. So that will be a priority. I think there are some risks if the EU does something legislatively controversial in this area before the UK has agreed dynamic alignment, that all of a sudden the reputation of the EU as a legislator and the desire to dynamically align could be called into question. And I think, to be honest, the UK government, as you can imagine, has sold the deal quite hard. I think there is a risk if there are not early dividends elements that have been promised. So I think there's a need to try and show some early successes. Fish, I mean, basically, as Dan was saying, for fish, we continue as we were with the agreement that was negotiated in the TCA, which incidentally gave the UK a 25% increase in the fish stocks that it was able to access, which is not small. There's been a disproportionate amount of press interest in whether you could have renegotiated it to have even more fish stocks. An extension, I think, is good news because it gives a degree of stability and certainty to everybody. It doesn't mean we'll never hear again about fish, because you'll still need to have an annual quota setting and series of licensing decisions, because fish move about, they die, the science changes. So you actually have to adjust all of these things annually, as indeed Norway does with the EU. But I think it does provide a very good stable platform. Just to note that actually the UK government has put in place £360 million fund for the fishing sector to help them through this extension. That's quite generous, actually, when you think that fishing in the UK accounts for about 7,000 jobs. So it's a pretty generous cushion, which I think acknowledges the political sensitivity of fishing, particularly to some coastal communities, particularly, for example, in Scotland. It's interesting the amount of airtime fish has got in the UK. And it's always slightly dismaying to me as somebody who's a veteran of fishing negotiations, because it always portrays the ownership of fish as being binary. You either got a lot of fish for yourself or you didn't. Actually, the genuine situation is much more nuanced. Fish and fish quota is only valuable to you if you can sell the fish. And it is a fact that most of the fish that fishermen in the UK catch is sold and has its market in the EU. So actually, the benefit to the fishing sector of having an SPS agreement that means that that movement can happen smoothly is immeasurable, and will make the quota that UK fishers hold immensely more valuable. I'm going to stop there, except to come back to a point I just made earlier, which is for businesses. I think the real issue is about trying to make sure that your priorities in this deal, and particularly on SPS, are clear to both the parties, and that you have open channels which you can use to discuss those priorities, and how you would like to see some of these forthcoming agreements sequenced. So I shall stop there, and I think that then means that I pass on to Matt. Is that right, Neil?
Yeah, I'll just say one thing to say. First of all, thank you very much indeed, Katrina. But also, to put a figure on what you were saying about exports, what I've read just recently is that UK fishermen export 86% to Europe of what they catch.
Yeah,
so
that's absolutely correct.
An amazing figure, I think. And the other point that I would make is all of this debate about the UK being a rule taker from Brussels is basically rather false, because ultimately in any agreement with any country, if you want to sell to that country, you actually have to meet their standards and their rules. So if you want to sell, you've got to accommodate those. It's not just sort of somehow a vassalage, as sometimes has been said in the UK. Sorry, anyway, I'm not going to talk any further.
It's all about sovereignty. But you're quite right. The average fish and chip customer in fish and chip shop customer in the UK does not eat langoustines, squid, and hake.
Exactly. Anyway, let me please pass the floor now to Matt, who's going to talk to us a little bit about his understanding of the energy aspects of this agreement, which, as far as I can see, are rather good. So, Matt, please.
Thanks, Neil, and delighted to be here this morning. I mean, yes, the energy aspects of the deal, it's pretty good, actually. And I think it's worth just taking a step back in terms of looking at how we got here. If you look at the TCA itself, signed in 2020, the energy title within the TCA is perhaps the most detailed chapter in there, because even in the more fraught negotiations at that stage, it was understood that you do need rules for energy trading, both gas, but particularly electricity, because electricity is very, very complex to trade, because you're trading not just a physical commodity, but a physical commodity that actually obeys the laws of physics as well. So it gets quite complex. So we started from a slightly higher base anyway, and then that's the importance of that kind of cross-border cooperation between Britain and Europe has only been accelerated because of what happened in 2022 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And if you go back to 2022, a variety of things happened that showed the interdependence of the UK and the EU in this space. So about 16% of the gas in EU gas storage came via at the end of 2022, came via the UK transmission system, via the UK liquefied natural gas terminals. But equally on electricity, during that year, the French nuclear fleet went down because of a variety of stresses on it, and the historical flows of the electricity interconnectors, which have normally gone 90% imports from France to GB, 10% exports, actually reversed entirely, and it was 90% imports into France from GB that year. That was also a year when there was a drought in Norway, and Norwegian hydro declined very significantly, and that was made up by UK imports as well. So there's real interdependence there. And then just to finish the point, what we can't do in the UK is we don't have enough gas storage to actually be able to manage a cold winter without EU gas storage. So there is real interdependency here, and I think that's become more and more understood over the last few years. So what's in the agreement itself? I mean, it's two major issues. One is it's in the context of North Sea cooperation, because the North Sea is a great opportunity for Northwestern Europe in particular in terms of offshore wind deployment. There are various cumulative targets of hundreds of gigawatts by 2050. And North Sea wind has very high load factors, meaning it operates a higher percentage of the time than onshore wind or solar, for example. So it's a very big opportunity for clean and secure power deployment. What was in the original TCA was rules for the trading of that electricity. That it was something called multi-regional loose volume coupling, which generally speaking, if you mention those words to anyone in the industry, people tend to throw their hands up in despair, because unfortunately it wasn't a viable system. It was kind of agreed as a compromise between two sets of red lines in 2020. And we spent a long time as the industry trying to get that to work. It was impossible. And so what's agreed in the text of this is very interesting, because it basically talks about exploring the participation of the UK in the EU's internal electricity market, to move back to a form of highly efficient electricity coupling, which I mean, it's more than I expected, put it like that. We know what was on the table beforehand wasn't going to work, and it was a unified position from UK and EU industry to say we've got to fix this, because the consequence of not having an efficient trading system was costing hundreds of millions on either side of the channel to consumers, but also making it harder to build out the kind of future cross-border infrastructure that's necessary to deploy large-scale renewable energy in the North Sea in the most efficient way possible. So we had to do this. There was a number of kind of public interventions in the run-up to this from the whole industry. And that, you know, I'm very happy to see has actually made a difference to both sides in terms of a real understanding that there are technical issues like this that will benefit both sides for real mutual benefit, and make reduce costs and actually make the deployment of clean energy infrastructure easier. So that's very positive. Is it going to be an easy negotiation? I mean, the parameters that are set out within the agreement talk about things like state aid, the promotion of renewables, protection of the environment, the rules of the electricity market. And you can see where there is going to be a debate there between the UK and Europe about the scope of those parameters. I think from an industry perspective, we would simply say both sides should be as flexible as possible on this, because there is real mutual benefit to be gained. And there's no real benefit at all in this space to divergence. So hopefully we can move forwards quickly on this, because there are a number of projects waiting to move forwards in this space, which will be a lot less complex and easier if we have agreed rules on this. The other big issue is the linking of the emissions trading systems. So the UK left the emissions trading system when we left the EU, but then we created a UK emissions trading system, which is a very similar construction, because not apart from anything else, the UK was fairly instrumental in building the original EU ETS back in the 2000s. So the model's the same. I think the industry view on this is there is a just per se benefit of being part of a wider carbon market anyway, in terms of more liquidity of the system, more efficient decarbonisation, and we have the same targets, frankly, as well. Both kind of a trajectory towards 2050, but also the same legally binding 2050 targets for emissions reductions. So that in itself is a good thing. It's even made even more important because of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism is the external border tariff around the EU. That would apply to the UK. It would specifically apply to clean electricity imports from the UK into Europe. It's incredibly difficult to work out how that would function in a way that didn't double tax clean electricity, and it was a fairly clear view from the analysis that we've seen over the last couple of years that it would have a very deleterious impact on clean power exports from GB into the EU. The numbers are massive, equivalent to the total capacity of Denmark, for example. It would increase curtailment in the UK system. It would increase costs across the board. So we think it's a very good thing that there is agreement to start negotiations over linkage. Once again, they're probably going to be quite politically and technically difficult, but once again, it is mutual benefit. And I would just say the real thing about the energy sector on this is that there is a unified view from both the UK and the EU industry, and that's really important. I think in the context of this relationship going forwards, it's very difficult to see us making that much progress in areas where there isn't that kind of mutual benefit. So overall, very positive, we'll see how the negotiations go. But as I say, I think from an industry perspective, the thing we'd be looking for is flexibility on both sides.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Matt. Before giving the floor to Mark van Herkelen, I wanted just to remind people that you have the possibility to ask questions. We've got 2 at the moment, so please start sending them in and I will try and then put those to the panel. But Mark, would you like to take the floor, please?
Thank you, Neil. Well, as a non-Brit in the panel, or on the panel, let me give you my take on what was decided on the 19th of May. As said by Dan and Katrina, it's a good summit outcome, but on the other hand, let's also be sober about it. It is full of declarations of intent. So the summit is basically a set of roadmaps that now need to be implemented. I think the 2 things that are the most important are, on the one hand, the partnership on defense and security, which I'm not going to speak about, and then what has been agreed upon with regard to trade and the internal market. On that, I believe the outcome is pretty reasonable, given the red lines on both sides. I mean, in the case of the UK, you started from the TCA, which is a bare bones hard Brexit. And then the Labour Party had said no single market, no customs union, no free movement of people. So those were the boundaries. And on the side of the EU, obviously, there is the wariness about cherry picking, the sort of indeed wariness about the Swissification of the EU-UK partnership. We have already reviewed what's in there with regard to single market. The most important one is indeed on SPS and on energy, where you're going to have, on the one hand, indeed more access for the UK into the market, but in exchange of that, you'll have the dynamic alignment of regulations and the role for the European Court of Justice, obviously very sensitive matters in UK politics. Now, what lies ahead? The first thing to remember is that because of the fact that the UK is a third country, we need to get into formal trade negotiations. In other words, the Commission has to ask the Council for a negotiation mandate to flesh this out, be it on SPS or be it on ETS or whatnot. Now, what may lie ahead, it's perhaps interesting to look at the EU-Swiss relationship right now. As you know, in December of last year, finally, the EU struck a deal with Switzerland. That deal was now initialed at the level of chief negotiators 2 days ago, and will now go then to the Council and Parliament on the EU side and the Swiss Parliament for adoption. And the text will be published when the Commission submits the text to the Council. And I think for all of the people who really want to look into the detail of these sorts of negotiations ahead, I think the EU-Swiss agreements, because it's a package of agreements, will be interesting to look into. You'll see things there on dynamic alignment. The question of when can you deviate from regulatory alignment. There are possibilities in the EU-Swiss framework, but then the EU will be allowed to take compensatory measures. Similarly, there is the issue of indeed Switzerland paying into the budget of the EU. Of course, the package that Switzerland has struck with the EU is much broader than what is now on the table following the 19th of May summit. But still, I mean, if you want to widen it, because it is also on road transport, it is on rail transport, it's on air transport, but it provides you with the blueprint of what you might call the partial integration into the single market. So I think that is something to study carefully, because it will provide you with the issues that will have to be tackled between the EU and the UK to get to an agreement. Mind you, all this takes time. Obviously, it doesn't need to take as much time as was needed between the EU and Switzerland. But with Switzerland, it started in, believe it or not, 2014. Then it broke off in 2021. The negotiations were resumed in 2023, and finally it crossed the line in December 2024. Obviously, the geopolitics are now much more conducive towards striking an agreement quickly, but I'm pretty certain it's not going to be a walk in the park. Back to you, Neil.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark, for that cheerful end note there. I've now got a number of questions from the audience, but before we go to them, I would like to just give panelists the chance to say anything that occurs to them having heard other panelists' intervention, and whether they wanted to put any questions to each other. If you just put up your hand, Matt.
I mean, I think just in response to Mark on the issue around the Swiss EU negotiations, I completely agree that those were quite a long and painful set of negotiations. If I look at ETS linkage, obviously there is an EU-Swiss linkage agreement, which I think took 7 years in total. That did include the referendum on freedom of movement within that period of time, the collapse of negotiations, but also the construction of the Swiss ETS itself. We obviously have an ETS in the UK, which is based on the EU mechanism. So I think it's a lot easier. My finger in the air, kind of ex-negotiators' sense of how long that might take, personally speaking, I think it's doable within 18 months. And there is, of course, an issue around the actual kick-in of the tariff on the CBAM, which starts on the 1st of January 26. And I would hope that there is now we are in active negotiations over ETS linkage, there is a way to avoid that coming in, because it's both a tariff barrier and a non-tariff barrier. And frankly, we've seen the impact of non-tariff barriers on the UK-EU trading relationship. I mean, there's lots of analysis out there, but if you take the OBR analysis as a relatively central one, it's a 15% reduction in trade intensity, and that comes from non-tariff barriers. So I think from an industry perspective, we would be extremely enthusiastic to see some way of avoiding the CBAM kicking in before we complete the ETS linkage negotiations. But I don't think it shouldn't take that long with political will, because the technical situation, I think, is a lot easier.
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, sorry, Mark, please go ahead.
No, I think you're absolutely right. There is no reason at all to waste time. The trouble is on ETS, as you have mentioned, from the 1st of January, CBAM kicks in, and I don't think the entry into force of CBAM will be postponed because of the UK-EU discussions. Furthermore, next year there's going to be a big revision on the EU side of the ETS. So the discussions will be interesting, because you'll have to work on the current situation, but then the goalposts are also going to be moving. And so, you're absolutely right. There is a very clear economic rationale for relinking, and I hope it's going to happen soon for the reasons that you mentioned, but it's going to be a bit messy.
Thanks very much indeed. obviously, if I understand rightly, Mark, the charges on CBAM have actually been delayed until 2027. Is that right?
No,
Okay,
that was for the EU deforestation regulation.
Okay, very good. If I may, I'm going to actually put into the play right now two questions which are very similar, one from Kevin O'Connor and one from Thomas Haugen, about what happens if it does take longer to agree ETS between the UK and the EU. Will there be any chance of negotiating some sort of interim exemption for the UK if that decoupling of the negotiations occurs?
My take on that would be no. What you're going to have is the EU system will look at the ETS price in the UK, which typically is lower right now than in the EU. And the difference between those two will have to be paid through a carbon border adjustment mechanism. But of course, it will be phased in. So as the free allowances are moved are removed, the CBAM kicks in. But I don't see readily how you would have a sort of exemption period.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. So I think you've already answered two questions from the audience. Were there any other panelists who wanted to make a remark about somebody else's comments? Matt, come back again.
Just very quickly on this point about the CBAM. I mean, I see what Mark's saying. I mean, I would be hopeful there might be a way around this, but it's worth noting that there are a bunch of things that need to happen anyway. At the moment, the UK ETS isn't recognised by the EU. At the moment, on the electricity side, the carbon intensity is calculated in a very crude 5-year look back. So coal is still included in it, where we have no coal in the system. So there are various things you can do to improve the situation, but it is worth just reiterating this is an economic negative for both sides. So finding a solution to that would be extremely, I think, welcome from an industry perspective.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Dan, did you want to take the floor?
Yeah, it was actually on something you said, Neil, earlier, but with relation to the dynamic alignment, because the reason why this is so controversial in the UK is I think everyone recognises when you export to the EU, those goods need to meet EU rules. But what the dynamic alignment would mean is that if you are not exporting to the EU, you would still have to follow EU rules, i.e., you know, a British company producing something that's just been produced in Britain, selling to someone else in Britain would come under the EU rules. And so I think that's the challenge with it. That's where it gets controversial in the UK.
No, I understand. Obviously, though, we would hope that UK companies will be able to start exporting to the EU again in a slightly easier environment than we have at the moment.
Yeah, the problem is most UK companies don't export to the EU and didn't even when we were. That's the challenge.
Thanks very much anyway. Katrina.
Yes, I mean, just to endorse Dan's point, and then I thought I might try and pick up a point that Megan has made in the questions about,
yeah, I was going to come to that.
Actually, you've only been out for 4 years. Have you diverged that much? Well, everybody always thinks about this in terms of did the UK diverge from the EU? Actually, the EU's cadre of legislation has been developing at the same time. So there's quite a big exercise just to try and work out where there might be divergence that you hadn't anticipated. And that goes through from everything from the big ticket examples like gene editing, which I mentioned, right through to things like product approvals and pesticide approvals, and the slightly different approach that the UK has taken, for example, on neonicotinoids.
Yeah.
And, you know, how do you then reconcile those divergences? Do you recognize them and then have measures in place to make sure that, you know, products that are affected don't access the EU market or access the EU market in a limited way? And then there are just some really bureaucratic things around EU approved plants.
Yeah.
You know, food production plants, abattoirs in the UK all used to be EU approved. They're not anymore. So there's a big sort of volume just of, work to do to get yourself into a position where the competent authorities are recognizing each other as partners in a slightly different way. But also there are some areas of divergence, and they're not all on the UK side.
Thanks very much indeed. That's really helpful. I'd like to take up a question which actually I was going to ask in a slightly different way from Jeremy Fleming Jones, which is really the question about all of the noise one gets in the UK media and from the Conservatives and the Reform Party about, well, we're going to reverse all of this. And his real question is, if this is all going to take such a long time, will we start having an influence on the negotiations by people's anxiety that actually a new government will come in X years and then essentially want to reverse it all?
I assume, is that for me to start?
Yeah, have a go. Go on.
Yeah, well, I mean, the political situation in the UK is stable at the moment, right? And
Exactly.
will be stable until probably 2029, I would imagine. So that does give, certainly from the UK side, the government the ability to get the agreements and also implement them so that people are seeing the impact of them prior to an election campaign. Because if Reform were to win the election outright in the UK in 2029, which I think is unlikely that they would win outright, they would probably need to rely on a coalition. They would almost certainly try and pick apart this deal. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But I think that's quite an unlikely scenario to be in, because I think the Conservative Party also have a bit of a dilemma with this, because if particularly the SPS agreement and the youth mobility scheme are enforced and in place 2 years before the election campaign, you're effectively then having a position to say, okay, let's cut off farmers' exports again. Let's stop young people going to Europe again. And the argument for the benefits of that, which would be the same argument as in the 2016 Brexit campaign, I don't think they will be as strong or resonate as much as they did back then. So the rhetoric now is very strong against this, clearly. I suspect if the negotiations are done relatively quickly and are enforced and people are already benefiting from them, by the time an election campaign comes, I suspect this is not a big issue, and it drops under the water a bit.
But do you think that could actually have an effect on the EU side's willingness to go quickly or not? Would they be saying, oh God, well, do we really want to invest a lot of time and effort into this exercise if there is a mad government in the UK in the future which unpicks it all?
No, I think it gives a more. Oh, sorry, Katrina.
So,
no,
Mark, go ahead, please.
I was just saying, I think that gives much more of an incentive to the EU to get it done, right?
So,
and have the benefit from their perspective, the benefits being demonstrated in the UK prior to having it, because in the UK this argument isn't going away. It's it's still an active argument, the UK relationship with the EU. So
actually, Katrina, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, I was going to just say, I mean, I agree with everything that that Dan has said, including his last point, that actually this might give a spur to both sides to try and get this thing agreed early. And as I was saying earlier, there is that kind of imperative of trying to show concrete benefits out of all of this. I think the other point I was going to make, I mean, both sides should have learned a little bit. Actually, our questioner very kindly talked about the EU-Swiss agreements. There were various points during the UK's exit negotiations and the negotiation of the TCA where there was a bit of a sense of, oh, well, there's another government around the corner, we'll just wait a bit. That didn't always go terrifically well. So I think Dan is right. It's more likely to mean that people will want to try and agree things more quickly to get there. The other thing I would say, all of you on the call have a stake in this. And actually, all of you, if you think this is the right direction to go, have the ability to be influencing this process and to be saying, it's best to get this done quickly. It's best to try and realize the benefits. if indeed you see benefits in an agreement. So, you know, actually, I think both sides will be buoyed up or slowed down by the response that they are getting from business and industry.
Mark, I think you wanted to come in this. Perhaps you can also answer a question on what's actually happened with the EU-Switzerland discussions, because I know for a long time the EU side was saying we're not going to do a whole lot of bespoke separate agreements. And in the end, as far as I understand, that's what they've actually ended up with in this agreement. But anyway, please also give your thoughts on the dynamics in Brussels here.
Yeah, well, as Katrina and Dan have said, I think the fact that you now have a Labour or a UK government which is willing to take the relationship upward again is definitely for Brussels a good thing. And indeed, the political purpose should be to try and have something implemented before the next UK elections.
Yeah.
To show that not only is this talk, it really makes a difference. And it's much harder for any UK government to undo things than to break off negotiations. Yeah. Having said that, on the EU-Swiss, I mean, as you know, it was amazingly complex. There were 120 sectoral agreements between the EU and Switzerland, and each had its own specific institutional dimension. So I think in Brussels, there were perhaps two people who really knew the EU-Swiss relationship. And that is something that everyone wanted to avoid in future. So what has happened now is you have indeed a package of agreements. Each package has its own institutional dimension, but when you look at them, they are basically identical. You can have marginal differences, but there is now a lot of harmonization across those packages. As I said before, interesting elements with regard to regulatory alignment and what you can do if you don't want to align. What the EU can then do in terms of compensatory measures. But then there's going to be what is called, I believe, an arbitration panel that looks into whether the compensatory measures taken by the EU are proportional or not. And then, in the end, with regard to the interpretation of EU law, of course, even Switzerland has accepted the authority of the European Court of Justice.
Okay.
For them was a huge red line, but in the end they crossed. But so it still is a package of agreements. It still is an issue where there is integration into the single market, but only for a number of sectors. For instance, services are basically not covered. Industrial goods are not covered except for conformity assessment. So it still is a mosaic of partial agreements. But that is where we are now. Obviously, we'll have to see what the Swiss make of it, because in all likelihood in 2027 only, this thing will be put to a Swiss referendum.
Lovely.
I don't think that the UK will want to go through that.
Nope. Thank you very much indeed. Referenda have had a rather mixed history in the UK. Your comment on the Swiss agreement reminds me of Bismarck's remarks on the Schleswig-Holstein question, where he said there are two people who know about the answer to the Schleswig-Holstein question. One's dead and the other one's gone mad. So, look, we are coming up now to 12:30. I had some questions that I would like to ask, but I don't want to hold up everybody much further. What I'd like to say to all of the panelists is saying thank you very much indeed for extremely informative and I hope at points entertaining comments, but certainly very useful for everybody who is actually engaged in looking at the relationship between the EU and the UK. And finally, my very sincere thanks to all of the people who have joined us for this conversation. I just would like to say that we have recorded it. So if there are colleagues of yours who have not been able to join us today, who would like to, there will be a recording on our YouTube channel, but also a link in our LinkedIn postings as Ruud Petersen Brussels, where you can access that same YouTube recording. So anyway, let us hope that this is going to be both quick and successful, and that it does indeed open a new chapter in the rather sorry story of Brexit. So thank you very much, and everybody have a nice afternoon, and see you all soon. Bye-bye.